Today we're going to dive into a massive idea, a truly grand experiment born from the ashes of a global war. We're talking about humanity's very first real shot at creating a world without war, the League of Nations. It was this beautiful, ambitious dream, and, well, it ended in spectacular failure. But how did it even start, and what can we learn from its collapse?
You know, to really get the League, you have to wrap your head around the absolute horror that came right before it. World War I, the so-called Great War. It was nothing less than an industrial-scale meat grinder. It just scarred the entire planet, and a whole generation looked at the old way of doing things, secret deals, rival alliances, and said, this is broken. It completely failed. People were desperate for something, anything, different.
So here's how we're going to break this story down. First, we'll look at how this dream was born from war. Then, we'll see how they tried to design a global guardian. We'll talk about the massive problem of an empty seat at the table from day one. Then we'll cover some surprising early wins before moving on to the catastrophic failures that followed. And finally, we'll unpack the incredibly important legacy it left behind.
All right, Section 1, the dream born from war. You know, it's kind of easy for us today to take things like international cooperation for granted. But a century ago, the idea of a world parliament to stop wars, that was seriously radical stuff. So where did it come from?
Well, the war was the catalyst for sure, but the engine driving this whole thing was a brand new idea: collective security. The concept was actually pretty simple. Instead of countries teaming up in rival gangs, an attack on any one member is treated as an attack on everybody. A bunch of thinkers were kicking this idea around, but its biggest champion, the guy who really put it on the world stage, was US President Woodrow Wilson. It was the capstone of his famous 14 points for peace, and he made it his personal crusade.
So with a powerhouse like the US president behind it, the idea started to get some real traction. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. How was this global guardian actually supposed to work? What did the blueprints for peace even look like? The League's official job description, which was written right into its founding charter, had four main goals. First and foremost, obviously, prevent another war, using that whole collective security idea. Second, get countries to disarm, because everyone figured that huge armies just made war more likely. Third, create a forum where countries could settle arguments with words instead of guns. And finally, get everyone to work together on stuff that affects us all, like public health. And if this structure looks a little familiar to you, well, it should. It basically became the blueprint for the UN and other groups. You had the Assembly, which was kind of like a big town hall where every country got a vote. Then there was the Council, a smaller group with the major powers meant to handle the big, urgent crises. You had a Secretariat to do all the day-to-day paperwork, and a World Court to settle legal squabbles. This was the peacekeeping machine they built.
So you have the machine, but how is it supposed to actually stop a fight from breaking out? Well, the plan was a kind of three-step escalation ladder. Step 1, talk it out. Bring your problems to the League. If that didn't work and a country got aggressive anyway, you move to Step 2, economic sanctions. Basically, you try to choke off their economy. And the absolute last resort, Step 3, was to recommend joint military action. Now pay close attention to that word, recommend. The League had no army of its own. This was a huge, huge weakness.
So the machinery is all set up. The dream is turning into a real thing. But from the very first moment, the League of Nations was crippled by a fatal flaw. A massive, gaping hole at the main table. A powerful, empty seat.
And this brings us to one of the greatest, most tragic ironies of the 20th century. How is it that the United States, the country whose president was the #1 cheerleader for the League, refused to join its own club?
Well, it came down to a bitter political showdown back in Washington. President Wilson believed America's destiny was to lead this new world, but the U.S. Senate, they were terrified of that very idea. They wanted to stick to America's traditional policy of staying out of other people's messes. They were worried the League would just drag the U.S. into one European war after another, and they were not about to give up Congress's power to declare war to some international committee. So the Senate rejected the treaty, and just like that, the League of Nations was kneecapped before it could even take its first step.
Now, losing the U.S. was a body blow, no question. But it wasn't a knockout punch, not right away. In fact, for its first 10 years or so, it actually looked like the League might just work. The 1920s were, surprisingly, a decade of small but very real victories.
For example,
Check out the Åland Islands dispute in 1921. Sweden and Finland were on the brink of war over these islands. Instead, they took the problem to the League. The League investigated and came up with a compromise. The islands would be Finnish, but their Swedish culture would be protected. And you know what? Both sides accepted it. Boom! War averted.
And it wasn't a fluke. A year later, you have this incredibly tense situation in Upper Silesia, this valuable industrial region right on the border of Germany and Poland. Things got violent. The League stepped in, carefully partitioned the territory, and managed to keep the peace. Again, a problem that could have easily exploded was diffused.
But maybe the most impressive show of strength came in 1925. Greek soldiers actually invaded Bulgaria after a border clash. Bulgaria immediately appealed to the League, and the League acted incredibly fast. It demanded a ceasefire and a Greek withdrawal. And it worked. A war was literally stopped in its tracks. For a brief, shining moment, it really felt like the dream was alive.
But that optimism of the 20s, it just didn't last. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, which unleashed all sorts of radical politics and aggressive new dictators. The League system was about to face its final exam, and it was going to fail spectacularly.
The first major crack appeared in 1931. Japan, a powerful member of the League's own council, invaded Manchuria in China. The League did what it was supposed to do. It condemned the invasion. But Japan's response set a chilling new precedent. They basically just shrugged, quit the League, and kept right on conquering. With no way to physically stop them, the League looked helpless. The bullies were winning.
The knockout punch, the one that really killed the League's credibility for good, came in 1935. Mussolini's fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. Now this time the League actually did impose sanctions, but they were a joke. They were weak, half-hearted, and they didn't include a ban on oil, the one thing that would have stopped Italy's war machine cold. Italy conquered Ethiopia, and the world saw that the League was nothing more than a paper tiger.
So why did it all fall apart? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm, really. You had the US missing, which left a huge power vacuum. Its main weapon, sanctions, turned out to be useless. It had no army to back up its threats. And it was up against a new kind of ruthless dictator who didn't care about the rules. On top of all that, its most powerful members, Britain and France, were so haunted by the last war they chose to appease the dictators, hoping to avoid another one.
Okay, so it's really easy to just stamp failure on the League of Nations and call it a day. And look, when it came to its #1 job, preventing World War II, it failed, miserably. But that's not the whole story, because out of that failure came a really, really important legacy. Think about that core idea of collective security. The League couldn't make it work in practice, but it put the idea on the map. It introduced this revolutionary concept to the world, the idea that an attack on anyone is an attack on everyone, and that peace is everybody's business. That idea was just too powerful to let die. And you can see that legacy right here. Think of the League as version 1.0 of global peace. A first draft. It crashed and burned, and the result was the horror of World War II. But in 1945, when the leaders of the world gathered again, they didn't throw the idea away. They built version 2.0, the United Nations, and they specifically designed it to fix the League's biggest flaws, like making sure the US was in from the start and giving its Security Council actual teeth.
So, in the end, yeah, the League of Nations was a failed experiment, but it might have been the most important failure of the 20th century. It was a painful, necessary lesson. It showed the world all the ways not to build a peace organization, providing the essential blueprint for the United Nations.
And that brings us to one final thought. The League itself is a ghost now, a relic of history. But its spirit, that core idea that we're all in this together and have to work to keep the peace, that's still very much alive in things like the UN. So, the question is, does the ghost of that failed dream still, in some way, help keep our own world from falling apart? Something to think about.